Hello, welcome to our two-part cybersecurity presentation. Today we have here myself, Janice Parson, and my co-presenter, Lynn Rowland. In this session, we will be talking about remedies to cybersecurity risks. As a quick introduction, again, I'm Janice Parson, VP within RGP's Advisory and Project Services team. I lead a number of cross-functional initiatives within finance, accounting, and risk and compliance. My focus is on finance and technology process design, risk management, and driving continuous improvement for our companies. With RGP is a global consulting company serving over 2,400 clients, which includes 3/4 of the Fortune 500. RGP enables rapid business outcomes by bringing together the right people who together create transformative change. Now I'll bring this over to Lynn.
Hi, thank you, Janice. My name is Lynn Rowland, and I lead RGP's cybersecurity, data privacy, and PCI practice. I have about 30 years of experience as a cyber risk advisor and compliance strategist for data privacy. So we'll move on to the agenda.
Great. So for today's agenda, we'll be talking about IT governance and security monitoring, securing the distributed work environment, training awareness, and vendor management. And I'll start off in terms of talking about the IT governance and security monitoring. So to start off, how do companies remedy and address cybersecurity risks? So reintroducing the IBM Security Report, which is the Cost of Data Breach Report 2021, a study conducted by the Putnam Institute. The costs were significantly lower for some organizations with a more mature security posture. And interesting data points here in that there's an 80% cost difference where security and AI automation was fully deployed versus not deployed. And in that, it's really more so in terms of security AI automation was associated with a faster time to identify and contain the breach from a detection and escalation component. The other data point was that the estimate was 1.76 million as a cost difference in breaches where mature zero trust was deployed versus no zero trust. And the study here concluded that implementing zero trust reduced the cost associated. To give a little background, zero trust is a security framework requiring all users, whether in or outside the organization's network, to be authenticated, authorized, and continuously validated for security configuration and posture before being granted or keeping access to applications and data. So to explore further, how do companies remedy and achieve a more mature security posture? Companies can start off by having to have strong governance and accountability, as well as implementing policies and implementation of controls. So from a governance and accountability perspective, making sure to employ a CISO and possibly a privacy officer, having to have the board of directors involvement, and making sure to have security awareness training. From an implementation of policies perspective, this could be from a data classification policy, data loss prevention policy, or incident response plan. And I'll dive a little bit deeper in terms of the implementation of controls. So in terms of implementation of controls, there are 3 types of controls to have and consider: preventative controls, detective controls, and corrective controls. From a preventative controls perspective, you'll want to consider hardening your organization's internal and external environment. And this may mean vulnerability, patch, and configuration management, as well as access and authentication. And also, as I mentioned earlier on zero trust, this could be examples in relations to extending access control management to servers and APIs, context-based multi-factor authentication, or automated offboarding of employees and contractors. So it's important to also continue to plan and test and enhance these controls. From a detective controls perspective, you can identify where preventative controls may have been bypassed. And this can be done through intrusion detection systems, security incident and event management, and activity monitoring. And then from corrective controls perspective, having to conduct an effective data breach response plan to limit the technical, business, reputational, and legal damages. And this could also include having to have incident response, forensics, disaster recovery, and business continuity, as well as insurance, just to make sure you have all things covered. Now, Lynn, I'm going to pass this over to you.
Wonderful, thank you. So securing a distributed work environment, what should you be doing in 2022 if you're not already? In the interest of time, I'm going to speak to just a few of the opportunities around mitigating risks and addressing some of the challenges that we see in the current cybersecurity landscape. So instead of going through 10, I'll probably hit about 4 different areas over the next couple of slides. I pulled together some questions that I believe frontline managers, as well as executives, should be asking internally about their IT security program, their maturity posture, or just their cybersecurity strategy in general. So under number 2, how good is your line of sight into the network infrastructure and all of the information systems and applications? This is really important because your sys admins really should be able to see all of your endpoints at all times using an endpoint detection and response solution of some type, an EDR tool. You should be able to remotely prevent malware attacks, ideally, data leakages, respond swiftly to threats, and automatically manage some of the software deployment and patching. Testing the controls around your antivirus software and how it's working as your next line of defense is also important to detect. And of course, block known malware. All of this is just good cyber hygiene. On the next slide, we have some questions there. And looking at number 3, I think it's good to ask, do we have an existing telework or remote working policy? Does a bring your own device policy and procedure exist? So a lot of organizations may have had BYOD in the last year or 2 and before the pandemic, but many of them didn't have the kind of policy and guidance that was necessary for such a huge work from home workforce. So, you want to make sure that you have a security policy that specifically is designed for your remote workers, whatever that looks like, and restrict remote workers to corporate issued devices only. I mean, that's one of the, I think, key enablers of just good cyber hygiene. And that would include ensuring like your cell phone network connections to email and Microsoft Outlook are all using encryption. And, I would add that making sure that employees are informed and aware of these policies and protocols are also necessary. Adding internal controls to hold employees accountable seems to be a lighter policy in some organizations. And so buttoning that up, making sure that employees are aware and informed and know that they're accountable for how they are implementing policies and protocols is key. The lack of communications to employees about these types of policies and expectations can have multiple impacts, from branding, a potential breach, or even a financial implication. On the next slide, some questions here. We had quite a few. I'd like to focus on number 6, which is remote access limited to network sections that enable employees to complete their tasks? In other words, all employees don't need access to all of the software and applications, at least in most instances. So every employer has data with varying degrees of value and sensitivity, you know, whether it's personal information, financial information, you know, employee reviews, intellectual capital, whatever it is. A lot of organizations have corporate and confidential information. So if access is imperative, such as, you know, to a lot of these types of sections on the network, it should be limited, we believe at RGP, to the content and time necessary to complete an employee's task, right? Do they need a week to go in and update, you know, a dozen or so employees' files for whatever the reason? Maybe not. Maybe they just need a day or two, and it's only to a very specific application. You know, limiting that content and time, and implementing multi-factor authentication credentialing is also really key. Couple more points on this. Corporate policies really should require a remote workforce. Well, there's a lot of things that it should require, but you know, two really important ones that sometimes get overlooked is for employees to secure their home router, right? You know, require them to affirm that they changed their router password when it was first installed, that, you know, all members of the family maybe are segregated and they have a different router that they're working through. But the second one is automated firm updates. It's so important to make sure that people just aren't leaving their laptops on continuously for days at a time, because they're rebooting, if it's not already forced, is going to ensure that the laptops have the firmware updates that are installed for security patches. On our next slide, and there's, I think, a couple of more questions. I'm just going to focus on number 8. I think a good question is, what is or should be our cybersecurity strategy across the enterprise? We're seeing a lot of organizations that aren't as mature, that don't have an enterprise-wide risk management strategy, that they're lacking a organizational-wide cyber strategy. And this is really important for most organizations. Haven't adopted a here to stay, work from home strategy. Most of our clients are revisiting their cybersecurity approach. They're recognizing that there are more enterprise risks, and ultimately that they need to update their cybersecurity strategy to reflect all of these increased risks that they have from the threat landscape of having more employees work from home. So if you can relate, then you should ask if you have a single sign-on or MFA, multi-factor authentication, for this new way to work, right? You know, determine if maybe you need an SSO and an MFA together. Ask if you should have incorporated a zero trust security model, as Janice had mentioned earlier, or implement an OT security strategy, right? So now is the time to determine how your business model and your workforce needs to have changed going into 2022, as opposed to what it looked like in 2019, 20, or last year. This way you can stay ahead of the cybersecurity threats, and you give yourself some time to implement these cyber defenses you need today and in 2022. So back to you, Janice. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Lynn. Great insights in terms of considerations for working remotely. Thank you for sharing that. Next, I'm going to highlight and just quickly talk about from a training and awareness perspective. So reintroducing the Verizon 2021 report, the Data Breach Investigations Report, just wanted to highlight again, and also highlighted in session 1, that the top breach pattern was related to social engineering. And also the other factor is that 85% of breaches include a human element. from a social engineering perspective. So really providing security awareness training is really key and important, and having to have training for your employees and others, so making sure to have considerations in terms of how to handle someone asking inappropriate questions. And with social engineering weakness, this is the human element. So at times people are not perfect. Maybe it's having to respect authorities or communication from the company's management. Perhaps it may be also having to consider that, employees might think that it won't happen here, but it's always important to make sure that employees are educated and trained from a security awareness perspective. From a security awareness education perspective, it's important to share and consider possible scenarios that may happen in that education, as well as how to handle someone asking inappropriate questions. In addition, it's important to be able to test employees on the training knowledge afterwards. So having to sending test emails, things of that sort, to have an understanding how much your employees do have an understanding from the security awareness perspective. And then also consider sending a follow-up survey. What would they change in the behavior based on the training? Do they have concerns in the work area after hearing this training? Or what can be improved and how can it be improved? Next, I'm going to highlight just in terms of key points from a vendor management perspective, as well as some of the similar concepts and points mentioned from session 1 that Lynn had brought up before. So in terms of outsourcing risk to consider, if you're having to consider a service provider to help in terms of a particular function in your organization, what risk should you be considering? So there are multiple factors to consider, but you want to be able to consider in terms of the handling and the processing of your data, the security and access, as well as availability of the system. Are they able to be available 99.9% of the time, or is there certain considerations that you may want to look into when you're having to put together your contract? Retention of the data. What is the provider's retention policy? Other possible factors specific to your business. Those are initial thoughts to consider. And then from having to consider from a service provider perspective, you want to be able to do the due diligence necessary in order to manage the risk and address any key stakeholder concerns. So evaluating the service provider, having to consider adequate requirements within the SLA or contract, having to designate a point of contact within the organization. It's important to have someone that's accountable and having to monitor the performance and the results of the service provider as well. The return on investment, leveraging a service provider, and then also just ensuring that the service offering does address the business needs of your organization. And then lastly, just having to have an understanding of how you can be able to trust and have confidence in the third-party relationship you form or contract with. It's having to also consider possibly obtaining an independent assessment. And this could be having to monitor through obtaining independent assessment over the service provider's internal controls, other compliance reports that might provide details to the user management and with the information that you need about the service organization's controls. And the assessment requirement options, it will depend on the industry and the specific needs that you have, either from a processing perspective or from a security perspective, but then that will vary and depend on what your needs are. So you have heard perspectives from Lynn and myself on remedies to consider today. Thank you for your time and thank you for watching the second session, Remedies to Cybersecurity Risks.